Your mother never really loved you, Leo, I heard my daughter in law Isabel say through the slightly ajar kitchen door, her voice a sliver of ice. She only ever saw you as a burden. The porcelain teacup in my hand trembled, a tiny, silent earthquake. A coldness, entirely separate from the winter air outside, began in my sternum and radiated outwards, down my arms, into my fingers, which had gone white where they gripped the delicate handle. I am Eleanor Vance. I am 72 years old, and that was my son she was speaking to. They thought I was just a simple old woman in a dusty old house, a relic to be managed, but they didn't know about the box, the heavy rosewood box I had kept on my dresser for 40 years. A silent promise from a man long gone, if they only knew what they had just thrown away. To understand why that box held the power to undo everything, to unravel the shimmering, beautiful lie of their lives, you have to understand who I really was and the man who had built my world. You have to understand Robert. My story doesn't begin in the polished, empty rooms my son now inhabits. It begins in dust, the dust of a West Texas town where the wind never stopped and money was a language we didn't speak. I was raised in a small clapboard house where the roof leaked in three different places, each drip with its own unique rhythm against the strategically placed pots and pans. My mother's hands were never soft. They were mapped with the cracks and calluses of a life spent scrubbing other people's floors. Humility wasn't a virtue for us, it was a uniform. We wore it every day. It was in the darned elbows of our sweaters and the careful way we ate, making sure not to waste a single crumb. I learned early that wealth wasn't just about what you had, it was about the ease with which you had it. The people my mother worked for had that ease. We had a constant low grade tension, the hum of scarcity that lived under our skin. I escaped on a scholarship to a state university, the first in my family. That's where I met Robert Franklin. He wasn't handsome in the way that turned heads. He was tall and perpetually stooped, as if listening to a secret the universe was whispering just for him. He was a physics student, and he had chalk dust permanently embedded in the cuffs of his shirts, a pale gray ghost of his passion. He didn't talk much about feelings. He talked about forces, vectors, and the elegant, undeniable truth of mathematics. He saw the world not as a collection of things, but as a series of interconnected patterns. Everything is a wave, El, he'd tell me, his eyes alight with a fire that was more compelling than any conventional charm. Energy, light, even us. We're just patterns of matter, oscillating for a brief time. We married a year after graduation. I became a librarian, finding a quiet joy in the order and silence of the stacks. Robert became a high school physics teacher. He was brilliant, a man who could have been a celebrated academic, but he chose to teach. He believed that igniting a spark in a 17-year-old's mind was a more profound act than publishing a paper no one would read. He taught with a fierce, quiet dedication. Our life was modest. We bought a small, sturdy house with a porch that sagged a little on one side, a house where the porch steps had been repaired so many times each one was a different shade of wood. We drove a used sedan for 15 years. We packed our own lunches. But Robert had a hobby. That's what he called it, like other men might call fishing or woodworking theirs. His hobby was investing. It wasn't the loud, aggressive trading you see in movies. It was silent, patient, and deeply strange. He wouldn't read the Wall Street Journal. He read obscure technical journals, publications from engineering schools, and declassified government research papers. He was looking for the source code of the future. The big waves start as ripples no one is watching, he'd murmur, hunched over a schematic for something called a semiconductor in 1975. He bought a few shares in a tiny unknown company that made them. He invested in a firm that was experimenting with drawing glass into thin fibers to transmit light, long before anyone called it fiber optics. He bought land in a dusty valley in California that no one wanted because he'd read a geological survey that suggested it had a unique and stable substrate, perfect for something he called data centers, decades before the term was common. He never sold. He called it compounding silence. He'd make his small, calculated investment, and then we would go on living our lives. He'd grade papers at the kitchen table, I'd mend his shirt collars, and somewhere in the unseen world of finance, a ripple was turning into a wave. He kept his records in a series of simple, spiral bound notebooks, filled with his dense, spiky handwriting. The numbers grew quietly, shockingly. It was a fortune built on the physics of the world, on understanding the underlying currents, while everyone else was distracted by the noisy surface. We never touched it. We never spoke of it outside the four walls of our home. It was Robert's masterpiece, a secret architecture supporting our simple life. "This isn't for us, Elle," he said to me once, his hand covering mine over one of the notebooks. "It's for what comes after. It's potential energy. It needs to be converted at the right time." Then Leo was born, our son. From the moment he arrived, he was the center of our universe. He had my eyes, but he had Robert's curiosity. I have a memory, sharp as a shard of glass, of a trip to the Science Museum when Leo was 7. He stood before a Foucault pendulum, his small face tilted up in rapt attention. Robert knelt beside him, not speaking down to him, but as an equal. He didn't just say, "It shows the earth is turning." He said, "Feel that? The floor beneath your feet is moving. The pendulum swing is fixed in space. But we, the room, the whole city, are turning under it. We're the ones in motion." I watched Leo's eyes widen the moment a concept clicked into place, a tiny spark of understanding. In that moment, he was so much his father's son. He was a child who could see the invisible forces. That was the boy I raised. That was the boy Robert adored. Robert passed away from a heart attack when Leo was 19, a sophomore in college. It was sudden, quiet, and left a hole in the world that felt like a physical law had been broken. The night before he died, he sat me down in his study. The room smelled, as it always did, of old paper, pipe tobacco, and that faint metallic scent of heated electronics from his old computer. He placed a heavy, intricately carved rosewood box on the desk between us. It was beautiful, dark, and sealed shut with no visible lock. "I want you to have this, Elle," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Everything is in order. Arthur Davies at Sterling Partners has all the information. He knows what to do." He pushed a small, crisp business card across the desk. "But this box, this is for Leo. Don't open it. Don't give it to him. Not until you have to. Not until he becomes the man I know he can be. The man who understands that the pendulum swing is true, even when the world is spinning." "How will I know when that is, Robert?" I asked, my throat tight. He smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "You'll know. And when you do, the key is in my old copy of Cosmos. Page 217. He squeezed my hand. "You were always the ballast, Eleanor, the anchor that let my kite fly. Don't ever forget your own strength." He was gone the next morning. The silence he left behind was immense. Leo was adrift after his father's death. The bright curiosity seemed to dim, replaced by a restless uncertainty. He finished his degree in business, a field Robert had always called applied psychology, and then he met Isabel. She was his opposite. Where Leo was hesitant, she was decisive. Where he was quiet, she was effervescent. She came from a background she never spoke of, but I could see it in the hungry way she looked at things, at clothes in shop windows, at expensive cars driving by. Her ambition was a palpable force. I understood it in a way. I recognized the ghost of scarcity in her eyes. But where my family had worn our humility as a shield, Isabel seemed to despise it. She saw it as a stain to be scrubbed away with money and status. The first time she came to our house for dinner, she walked into the living room, and her eyes did a quick, cold scan. The worn velvet of Robert's favorite armchair, the faded Persian rug we'd bought at a flea market 30 years ago, the shelves groaning with books instead of ornaments. "Oh, Eleanor," she said, her voice a perfect imitation of warmth, "your home is so authentic. It's truly refreshing to see someone so wonderfully unconcerned with appearances." There it was, the first cut. It was a compliment shaped like a jewel, but it was meant to draw blood. She was telling me my home was old, out of fashion, and that I was too. It was the first of 1,000 such cuts, each one delivered with a bright smile. "All jobs are dignified, of course," she said when I mentioned my retirement from the library. "It's just so lovely that you had a passion that wasn't about, climbing a ladder." She performed wealth because she had been brutally mocked for not having it. I learned later, from a stray comment Leo let slip, that she had grown up in a cramped trailer on the outskirts of a wealthy town. She told him how her mother, a proud woman, would cry in the car after other mothers at the grocery store saw her pay with food stamps, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. Isabel's entire life was a reaction to that memory, a desperate, frantic race away from that humiliation. I understood why she was the way she was, but understanding is not the same as forgiveness. Leo, my curious, thoughtful boy, began to change. He started to adopt Isabel's language. My house wasn't homey anymore, it was cramped. My simple, home cooked meals were quaint. They wanted to get married. Isabel had a vision. It involved a specific venue, a specific photographer, and a specific designer dress that cost more than my car. Leo came to me, his face a mask of hopeful anxiety. "Mom, we need some help with the wedding," he said, unable to meet my eyes. "It's just to get started on the right foot." "On the right foot" cost $75,000. I wrote the check. The money came from the first full portfolio Robert had ever built, a collection of stocks he'd called the Archimedes Fund. Selling it felt like tearing a page out of our history. But I did it for Leo, for his happiness. That was the beginning of the ledger, the invisible accounting I kept in my head. A year later, they wanted to buy a condo. They'd found the perfect place, Isabel gushed, in a building with a doorman and a rooftop pool. They just needed a little help with the down payment. $50,000. That was nearly all of my personal savings, the money I had put aside from my librarian's salary over 40 years. My what if fund. What if the roof finally gives in? What if the car dies for good? I looked at Leo's hopeful face and I wrote the check. I drained the account. Then Leo wanted to start his own business, a strategic consulting firm. Isabel had designed the logo and the business cards. He needed seed money just to get the office set up and build a client base, Mom. This is my chance to be my own man. Being his own man cost $100,000. I called Mr. Davies for the first time in years. He was quiet, professional. I told him which bonds to sell. They were the ones Robert had labeled in his notebook. For a rainy day, it felt like a storm was coming. There were smaller things. A $15,000 vacation to St. Bart's because Isabel's friends were all going, and it would be social suicide not to. A $10,000 loan to cover a credit card bill she'd run up on a single shopping trip. Each time, Leo would come to me with the same pained expression, the same assurances that this was the last time, that this was the final piece they needed to be secure. The total in my mental ledger climbed. Over 10 years, it reached $482,300, not including the $2,000 a month I transferred to their account to help with living expenses. I gave it all. I gave it because he was my son. I gave it because I thought I was giving him a foundation, a chance at the ease I never had. I gave it because a part of me, the part that still saw a 7-year-old boy staring at a pendulum, believed that underneath the expensive suits and the borrowed confidence, my Leo was still in there. I kept telling myself that this was an investment in his happiness. But it wasn't. It was fuel for Isabel's fear. And I was the one holding the pump. I lived my simple life. I shopped at the grocery store. I read my books. I tended my small garden. They lived a life of shimmering surfaces, of restaurant openings and gallery nights, all of it built on Robert's silent, patient work, funneled through my quiet, patient love. And they began to resent me for it. My simple house became an embarrassment. My modest clothes were a reflection on them. My very existence, quiet and unassuming, was a rebuke to the loud, glittering world they were trying to build. I was the inconvenient, dusty truth they wanted to hide in the attic. Which brings me back to that cold Tuesday afternoon, standing outside my own kitchen, holding a teacup that had suddenly become impossibly heavy. They had come over, a rare visit, to talk about my future. That's how Isabel had phrased it on the phone. I knew what it meant. They wanted me to sell the house. It was too big for me, they said. The upkeep was too much. They had found a lovely senior living community for me. It was a place with small, sterile rooms and the smell of antiseptic, a place where I would be neatly tucked away. I was bringing them tea, the good Darjeeling I kept for special occasions, in my mother's china cups, and I heard her voice. Your mother never really loved you, Leo, Isabel said. The words were not shouted. They were spoken with a calm, clinical precision, which made them all the more brutal. Look at this. She holds on to this dusty old house. This money, its control, Leo. A mother's love is supposed to be freeing. Hers is a cage. She doles out money to keep you dependent, to keep you coming back to her. She never wanted you to be your own man. She only ever saw you as a burden she had to manage. I heard the scrape of a chair. Leo's voice was weak, a pale imitation of protest. That's not true, Izzy. She helped us. Helped us? Isabel's laugh was a sharp, ugly sound. She gave us scraps from a fortune she's hoarding. Do you have any idea how much that house is worth? How much she must have socked away? A real mother would have given you everything, set you up for life. She would have wanted you to be happy, successful, not tethered to her guilt. She doesn't love you. She resents you. She resents your success, your life, me. Can't you see it? The teacup slipped from my saucer and shattered on the hardwood floor. The sound was shockingly loud in the sudden silence from the kitchen. Neither of them moved. Neither of them came to see what had happened. They just stopped talking. I stood there frozen, looking at the broken pieces of porcelain and the spreading stain of tea. It looked like a wound. A stone had formed behind my sternum, heavy and immovable. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger. It was a cold, terrifying clarity. A 40-year-old delusion had just shattered on the floor along with the china. She was right about one thing. It was a cage, but I wasn't the jailer. I was the other prisoner. All these years I had believed I was giving my son love, but he hadn't received it as love. He had received it through Isabel's filter, as a transaction, as a tool of control, as a thing to be resented. I had given away pieces of Robert's legacy, pieces of my own security, not for my son's happiness, but to furnish the stage for Isabel's performance of wealth, and in the process I had lost my son completely. He was a stranger in my kitchen, listening to his wife tell him I had never loved him. And he was not defending me. Slowly my legs started to work again. I turned, not bothering to clean up the mess, and walked back through the quiet hall. I passed the framed photo on the wall, the one of Leo at age 7, perched on Robert's shoulders at the Science Museum, his face alight with wonder. The glass seemed to frost over as I looked at it, the memory suddenly belonging to another life. Something inside me changed. It wasn't a snap, it was a slow, tectonic shift. The soft, yielding ground I had stood on for decades hardened into granite. The woman who had written every check, who had absorbed every backhanded compliment, who had believed in the power of quiet sacrifice, was gone. In her place was someone else, someone colder, someone who remembered Robert's last words. Not until you have to. I walked into my bedroom. My hands were perfectly steady now. I went to the bookshelf, past the novels and poetry, to the small section of science books I had kept. I pulled down the heavy, worn copy of Carl Sagan's Cosmos, its cover soft as suede, from Robert's hands. I turned to page 217. Taped to the page, next to a diagram of a spiral galaxy, was a small, ornate brass key. It felt warm in my hand. Real. I turned and looked at the rosewood box on my dresser. It had sat there for 23 years, a silent, patient sentinel. It was time. It was long past time. I had to. The key slid into a hidden keyhole on the underside of the box with a soft, satisfying click. I took a breath and lifted the lid. The air inside smelled of cedar, paper, and time. I had expected stock certificates or deeds or some other financial instrument, but that wasn't what was inside. My breath caught in my throat. The box was filled, neatly and chronologically, with my son's entire childhood. His first pair of shoes, bronzed and heavy, a lock of his baby, fine hair, tied with a blue ribbon, every report card from kindergarten to his college graduation, a stack of crayon drawings, their colors still bright, lopsided houses with smiling suns, stick figures of me and Robert and him holding hands, the program from his 5th grade piano recital, the medal he won at a middle school science fair for a project on volcanic eruptions, his high school diploma, a photograph of him and Robert, heads bent together over a model rocket, their faces identical in their concentration. It was a museum of my love, a meticulously curated archive of a devotion so complete, so absolute, that it had been documented and preserved in tangible form. 40 years of motherhood, packed into a single box. Beneath it all, at the very bottom, was a thick cream-colored envelope. In Robert's familiar spiky script, it just said, "For Leo." Tears streamed down my face, not from sadness, not from grief. They were tears of rage, a cold, quiet rage that a love this vast, this documented, could be so easily dismissed as a burden. That the woman in the next room could look at the result of all this and see only resentment. I closed the lid of the box. I picked up the business card from the desk drawer where I had kept it all these years. Arthur Davies, Sterling Partners. I picked up my phone. My fingers were steady as I dialed the number. "Mr. Davies," I said, my voice unfamiliar to my own ears. It was not the voice of a woman asking for permission to exist. It was the voice of a woman giving an order. "This is Eleanor Vance, Robert Franklin's wife. It's time." The silence on the other end of the line was brief. Then his voice, calm and professional. "Eleanor, I've been waiting for your call. What do you need?" "Everything," I said. "I need to see everything." The offices of Sterling Partners were on the 45th floor of a glass and steel tower downtown. The air inside was cool and still, and it smelled of expensive leather, old paper, and power. It was a world away from my house, with its scent of cedar and books. Mr. Davies was an older man, impeccably dressed in a gray suit, with kind eyes that had seen everything. He didn't rush me. He led me to a large conference room with a window that looked out over the entire city. "Please, Eleanor, sit," he said, gesturing to a large leather chair. He sat opposite me, a thin laptop on the polished mahogany table between us. He didn't engage in small talk. He simply opened the laptop, his movements precise and economical. "Robert was a unique man," he began, his eyes on the screen. "He wasn't a client, not in the traditional sense. He was a partner. He saw things, patterns. He structured his portfolio not for growth, but for resilience. He called it an endowment for the future. Your future." He turned the screen toward me. There were columns of names and numbers, charts and graphs. I didn't understand most of it. But at the bottom of the screen, in a bold, clear font, was one number. The total current value of the Franklin endowment. I stared at it. The number was so large it seemed unreal, a string of digits with no connection to the physical world. I saw the number, and my mind immediately went to the threadbare towels in my bathroom and the crack in my kitchen linoleum. I thought of the $20 bills I carefully budgeted for groceries each week. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I gripped the arms of the chair. My legs felt weak. Are you all right, Eleanor? Mr. Davies asked, his voice gentle. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, my eyes still fixed on the screen. It was more than a fortune. It was a kingdom built in silence by a high school physics teacher waiting for his queen to claim it. Mr. Davies seemed to understand. He closed the laptop slowly. Your husband, he spoke of you often. He said you were the ballast that let his kite fly. He trusted you implicitly, Eleanor. He said you had a moral compass that was truer than any market trend. The entire estate is structured within a trust. You are the sole trustee and beneficiary. You have absolute and total control. He paused, then leaned forward slightly, his professional composure softening for a moment. He also left very specific instructions. He said that if you ever called me, it meant that the potential energy needed to be converted to kinetic energy. His words. He said my job was to provide you with the tools to do so. For the first time since I had heard Isabel's voice through the door, I felt a flicker of something other than cold rage. I felt Robert's presence in that room, his foresight, his unwavering faith in me. What do I do now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Now, Mr. Davies said, his voice firming up again, we secure your position. We change everything. Starting today. The next few days were a blur of methodical action. The first thing I did was call a locksmith. He was an older man named Sal, with hands as gnarled as ancient tree roots and a face etched with a lifetime of quiet observation. As he expertly fitted a new heavy deadbolt to my front door, he didn't ask any questions. He just worked. The silence comfortable between us. When he was finished, he handed me a set of 3 brass keys. You know, he said, wiping his hands on a rag, the funny thing about a good lock isn't keeping people out. It's about deciding who you let in. Gives you a kind of peace knowing you hold the only key. He looked me straight in the eye, and I knew he understood more than he was letting on. His words settled in me, a small, hard piece of wisdom. I was deciding who to let in, and more importantly, who to keep out. Mr. Davies guided me through the rest. We opened a new set of bank accounts at a private bank, accounts that were in my name alone, completely firewalled from anything connected to Leo. We systematically canceled the automatic $2,000 monthly transfer I had been sending to my son for a decade. The final transfer had gone through the day before I heard the conversation. There would not be another. We drew up new legal documents, reinforcing my position as the sole trustee of Robert's estate, making it legally untouchable by any outside party. Each action was a small reclamation of my own life. A quiet click of a lock, a signature on a form, a phone call to a bank. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. For the first time in years, I did something purely for myself. I went to a local nursery and bought a new orchid for my windowsill. It was a single, perfect white phalaenopsis, its petals like sculpted silk. It wasn't expensive, but as I placed it in the sunlit window of my living room, it felt like a declaration of independence. It was mine. The first tremor from their world reached me 3 days later. My phone rang. It was Leo. Mom! His voice was tight with confusion. Hey, weird question, but the transfer didn't go through. The monthly one. Did you forget, or is everything okay? I took a breath. I'm making some adjustments to my finances, dear, I said, my voice calm and even. Adjustments? What kind of adjustments? There was a pause, and then I heard Isabel's voice in the background, sharp and impatient. Then she was on the phone. Eleanor, she said, dispensing with any pretense of warmth. What is this? Leo said you're making adjustments. Don't play games. We have bills. That money is part of our budget. Our budget. The audacity of it stole my breath for a second. My money from my husband's life's work was a line item in her budget. The arrangement we had is no longer in effect, Isabel, I said, the words tasting like freedom. What do you mean, no longer in effect? She sputtered. You can't just do that. We rely on that. Yes, I said quietly. I know. Goodbye, Isabel. I ended the call before she could reply. My hand was shaking, but not from fear. It was from the shock of my own power. The next escalation came a week later. It was a thick cream-colored envelope delivered by a courier. Inside was a letter from a law firm I had never heard of. They were representing Mr. and Mrs. Leo Vance. The letter was dense with legal jargon, but the message was brutally clear. They were filing a petition with the court to grant them conservatorship over my estate. The petition cited my recent erratic financial behavior, my social withdrawal, and my advancing age as evidence of potential cognitive decline. They were claiming I was no longer competent to manage my own affairs. They were doing it, the letter stated, for my own protection. I felt a surge of nausea. They weren't just trying to get the money back. They were trying to erase me, to declare me mentally unfit, a non-person, so they could gain complete control. Isabel's strategy was clear. If the goose won't give you the golden eggs, you seize the goose. I immediately drove the letter to Mr. Davies. He read it without a change in his expression, his face a calm, impassive mask. "This is a standard playbook, Eleanor," he said, placing the letter on his desk. "It's ugly, but it's predictable. They're trying to intimidate you into submission. Don't worry, we will prepare." And prepare we did. Mr. Davies was no longer just a wealth manager. He was my general. He brought in a team. He hired a litigator, a woman named Miss Albright with eyes like chips of flint, who specialized in elder law. And he hired a private investigator, a discreet man named Mr. Chin. "We don't fight this by defending your competence, Eleanor," Ms. Albright explained in our first meeting. "That's their frame. We fight it by exposing their motive." Mr. Chin's report came back a week later. It was a portrait of desperation. Leo and Isabel were leveraged to the hilt. They had 2-car loans on vehicles they couldn't afford. They had a personal loan from a high-interest lender taken out to fund Leo's business. They had maxed out 6 different credit cards. The shimmering life they presented to the world was a house of cards, and my monthly contributions were the only thing holding it up. The PI discovered that the new business venture Leo was supposedly launching was being funded by a loan shark known for his brutal collection methods. They were drowning, and then the invitation arrived. Isabel called, her voice once again dripping with saccharine sweetness, as if the lawyer's letter had never happened. "Eleanor," she chirped, "I have the most wonderful news. Leo's new venture has secured its final round of funding. We're having a little celebration to thank all the investors and supporters. It's at the Crystal Room at the Grand Hotel. You simply must come. It's so important for Leo to have his family there to see his success." There it was, the stage, the public forum where they would perform their victory, surrounded by the people whose opinions they valued. A room full of witnesses. They didn't want me there to celebrate. They wanted me there as a prop. The dotty old mother, safely managed, a testament to their compassionate care, while they painted a picture of their own brilliance. They had no idea I knew about the debts. They had no idea I knew about the loan shark. They had no idea that I was no longer a prop. "Of course, dear," I said, my voice betraying nothing. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." The night before the party, a profound quiet settled over the house. The winter sky was a deep starless black. I sat in Robert's armchair in the dark, the rosewood box resting on my lap. Its surface was cool and smooth beneath my hands. The weight of it was the weight of my life, of Robert's life, of the son we had raised. A memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. Leo, maybe 4 years old, had fallen asleep in my lap while I was reading to him. I remember the specific innocent weight of his head on my chest, the faint, sweet smell of his hair after his bath, his small, chubby hand curled tightly around my index finger, as if he were anchoring himself to me in his dreams. A wave of grief, so powerful it was a physical blow, washed over me. It felt like my ribs were cracking. Was I doing the right thing? Was this justice, or was it a cold, calculated revenge? Robert's words echoed in my mind. not until he becomes the man I know he can be. By doing this, by orchestrating this public unmasking, was I declaring that he never would be? Was I destroying my own son to save myself from his wife? The little boy in my memory, the one with the fierce grip and the sweet smelling hair, deserved better than this. The doubt was a physical sickness, a sour taste in the back of my throat. For a long, dark hour, I considered just letting it all go, selling the house, giving them the money, and disappearing into that sterile senior community they had picked out for me. It would be easier, it would be quieter. As then I remembered Isabel's voice, the clinical cruelty of it. Your mother never really loved you. The words cut through the fog of my grief. This wasn't about destroying Leo. It was about saving him. It was about shattering the funhouse mirror he had been looking into for 10 years. A mirror that distorted my love into control and his own weakness into ambition. He needed to see the truth. He needed to see what his life was built on and what his wife was. Robert hadn't asked me to wait for Leo to become a man on his own. He had trusted me to show him the way if he got lost. The doubt receded, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. This was not an act of destruction, it was an act of love. A terrible, painful, necessary love. I stood up and went to my closet. I didn't have anything that would fit in at the Crystal Room. My wardrobe was a collection of well-made, simple things I'd owned for years. I chose a charcoal gray sheath dress, a piece I'd had for at least 2 decades. It was elegant in its simplicity, but in that room it would make me look like a poor relation. Perfect. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror on the back of the closet door. I saw a 72-year-old woman with tired eyes and lines of grief etched around her mouth. I looked frail. I looked like a victim. I turned away from the mirror. I went back to the living room and picked up my canvas tote bag, the one with the faded museum logo from that long-ago trip. I placed the heavy rosewood box inside. Then I put on my simple cloth coat, picked up my keys from the hall table, and walked out the door. The cold night air felt like a slap, but it was bracing. It was real. The Crystal Room was aptly named. It was a cavern of light, sound, and money. Chandeliers like frozen waterfalls dripped light onto a sea of people dressed in shimmering fabrics and expensive jewels. The air was thick with the scent of lilies, champagne, and a dozen competing perfumes. The sound was a low roar of self-congratulation, the clinking of glasses and the bright, brittle laughter of people performing happiness. I stood in the doorway for a moment, in my plain gray dress and my worn coat, holding my canvas tote bag. I had never felt more out of place in my life. I was a ghost from a different world. Isabel spotted me. She was holding court near the center of the room, a goddess in a backless gown of liquid silver sequins that clung to her like a second skin. Her smile was brilliant, but when her eyes landed on me, it tightened for a fraction of a second. She excused herself and glided over, her hand taking my elbow in a grip that was surprisingly strong. "Eleanor, so glad you could make it," she said, her voice loud enough for those around her to hear. She was playing the part of the dutiful daughter-in-law. "Let me find you a comfortable seat. You must be tired." She steered me not toward the main tables where Leo was surrounded by beaming men in tailored suits, but to a small, isolated table in a dim corner near a service entrance. "You just sit here and relax," she said, patting my shoulder with a gesture that was both condescending and dismissive. "We'll bring you a nice sherry." She was hiding me. The embarrassing old mother. She turned and melted back into the glittering crowd without a backward glance. I sat there for what felt like an hour, watching. I watched Leo, my son, accept congratulations, his face flushed with a mixture of pride and anxiety. He looked handsome and successful, but his eyes kept darting around the room, never settling. He was playing a role, and he was terrified of forgetting his lines. I watched Isabel at his side, her hand possessively on his arm, her smile never wavering. She was the director, the producer, and the star of this entire production. Finally, the moment came. The lights dimmed slightly. A man tapped a glass for attention, and Leo stepped onto a small raised platform. He was giving a speech. He thanked his visionary partners and his strategic investors. He talked about synergy and disruption and a dozen other words that meant nothing. And then he turned to his wife. But most of all, he said, his voice thick with rehearsed emotion, I have to thank my incredible wife, Isabel. She is the rock, the inspiration. She always believed in me. He looked out into the crowd, his eyes passing right over my corner, even when others didn't. The words landed like stones in the pit of my stomach, even when others didn't. He meant me. In this room full of strangers, he was publicly confirming Isabel's poison, that my love had been a form of doubt. Applause rippled through the room. As it died down, I stood up. I picked up my canvas tote bag and began to walk from my dark corner toward the center of the room, toward the light. A few people turned to look, a flicker of annoyance on their faces at the interruption. Isabel saw me coming, and a flash of pure fury crossed her face before she masked it with a tight, concerned smile. Mom, Leo said, stepping down from the platform, his voice a low, urgent hiss. What are you doing? Sit down. I just have a few questions, I said. My voice was quiet, but it seemed to cut through the ambient chatter. The room began to fall silent, people turning to watch the unexpected drama. Eleanor, this is not the time or the place, Isabel said, trying to intercept me, her hand reaching for my arm again. I ignored her and looked directly at my son. Leo, I said, my voice gaining strength, do you remember when you were 10? You wanted that Meade telescope for your birthday more than anything in the world. It was so expensive. He stared at me, his face a mixture of confusion and horror. Mom, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the telescope, I said calmly. The one I bought you. I was working part-time at the library then. I took on extra evening and weekend shifts for 6 months to save the money for it. Do you remember how your face lit up when you saw it? He was silent, his face paling. The people around us were listening intently. I remember, I continued, my voice clear and steady now. I also remember the $75,000 for your wedding, so Isabel could have the dress she wanted. I remember the $50,000 for your condo down payment, which was my entire life's savings. I remember the $100,000 to start your first business. I remember the $15,000 for the trip to St. Bart's. And I remember the $2,000 a month, every month for the last 10 years. I paused, letting the numbers hang in the air. I kept a ledger in my head. It comes to $482,300, not including the monthly stipends. All from a woman who, I'm told, never really loved you. A collective gasp went through the room. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Isabel's face had gone from furious to a waxy, artificial white. Leo looked like he was going to be sick. And in that perfect, terrible silence, a waiter appeared at Isabel's elbow. He leaned in and whispered something to her. The last vestiges of color drained from her face. She fumbled in her ridiculously small, jewel-encrusted purse and pulled out a gleaming platinum credit card, pressing it into his hand. The waiter disappeared and returned a moment later. He leaned in again. I'm very sorry, madam, he said, his voice just loud enough for the tables nearest them to hear, though in the dead silence it carried across the room. It has been declined. Shall I try another card? Isabel just stared at him, her mouth slightly open. The carefully constructed illusion of her life had just been publicly shattered. The great success story couldn't even pay for her own party. This was my cue. I walked the final few feet to their table. I reached into my simple cloth coat and took out the wallet I'd carried for 30 years. From it, I produced a card. It was not a credit card. It was a simple, heavy, black piece of plastic with no numbers, just my name and the name of the bank embossed in silver. A private banking card Mr. Davies had given me. I placed it on the table in front of the horrified waiter. It made a solid, definitive clack on the polished wood, a sound like a gavel falling. Put the entire evening on this, I said to him. He took it, his eyes wide, and scurried away. I turned to Isabel. Her face was a mask of utter, uncomprehending disbelief. You were right about one thing, Isabel, I said, my voice soft but carrying the weight of a lifetime. A mother's love should be freeing. It is not a cage. Then I looked at my son, at Leo, who stood frozen, his eyes filled with a dawning, catastrophic understanding. Your father left you something, I said. He left you a letter. He asked me to give it to you when you became a man. I'm still waiting. I picked up my canvas tote bag. I did not take the card back. I turned and walked toward the exit. I did not run. I did not look back. Every eye in the room was on me, but I didn't see them. The silence followed me, a physical presence, pressing at my back as I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the cold night air. The air outside was sharp and damp, smelling of car exhaust and the cold pavement of the city. It was a relief after the cloying atmosphere of that room. I didn't get a taxi. I just started walking, my simple coat pulled tight around me, the strap of the